The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. 360 Energy is a North American leader in energy and carbon reduction. Recently, we have launched the 360 Carbon Excellence Program, designed to make corporate climate change actions more effective and successful. For more information, check the link in our podcast description. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Great to be back.
Yes, and looking forward again to another fascinating topic.
As always. So today we are going to introduce and discuss the energy transition. And Dave, I will pass this to you to kick off.
Thank you, Lysandra. And for all our listeners, you may have heard this word, the energy transition, and really not quite comprehend what it means. So I'll define it for you. So it's a transformation or an energy shift that refers to significant and long-term change in the ways energy is produced, distributed, and consumed within society and our economy. So it has all three elements. It's not just produced, it's distributed and consumed. So this touches everyone in society, not just limited to energy producers or things of that nature.
Thanks for that, Dave. Now I'm excited to pass this to John because John always gives us some interesting facts. What do we have over here?
Well, I hope so, because when we said we were going to talk about the transition, I thought to myself, we all keep talking about this as if it's something new. It's not. We've had a number of transitions over history, and I'm going to sort of just do a little potted history tour. So let's go back to the Industrial Revolution. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, what were our main energy sources? They were people, animals, and wood. Coal started happening. We started mining for coal. We needed to pump water out of coal mines. And so we started developing steam engines. And put a date on that, first steam engine was around about 1712. It took nearly 50 odd years before it got refined with Newcomen and his. And then we ended up, it wasn't until 1804 that there was a steam locomotive. And then George Stephenson and his rocket, which is sort of famous as being the first commercially successful locomotive, that happened in 1829. So there we go. We've gone from humans, animals, wood to a coal and steam-based economy. So it all stops, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. If we now move on to 1886, and a fella called Carl Benz had a patent for a vehicle powered by a gas engine. And that's arguably the first car that we've got. And to think about what happened with that, public transport before then was horse and carriage, horse-drawn trams. New York saw the end of its horse-drawn carriages for public transit in 1917. So there you go. We've got another change. I've got two more examples. One, 1945, there was the Manhattan Project, which people will be aware of because of the Oppenheimer and all that's involved with that. I hadn't realised this, and I looked at this. 1954, first nuclear power station, 5 megawatts of power in Russia. So the Americans catch up in 1955. I almost want to ask you, and when do you think Canada joined the game? Well, I'll help you out. They joined the game in 1962, and that was a demonstration reactor in Rolphton, Ontario, no longer in function. So there again, there's another move. But an interesting one, which is a UK one, is North Sea gas. Now, before North Sea gas, we had what was called Towns gas, which was made from coal. You gasified coal, you ended up with coke, you had gas. 1965, we discover natural gas, or as we called it here for promotional purposes, high-speed gas. We discovered natural gas in the North Sea. In 1968, we started a programme of converting all the gas appliances in the UK to run on this new gas. It was a programme that converted 40 million appliances. It took 10 years to do it. And in 1976, all of the gas network was converted. It doesn't stand still. We've always had transitions, and they've all been driven by different types of things. The nuclear power was going to be free power. It was going to be cheap power. It was going to be unending. North Sea gas was a fraction of the cost of making Towns gas. When we got to the Industrial Revolution, we suddenly knew we needed to make things, so we needed more energy. So there has always been a transition. Now, the question is, are we about to start a transition, another one, or are we already in it? And I'm going to ask Dave to respond to that.
Yeah, John, it's a very good point. I mean, we hear daily on how this transition is uneconomical. It's just wrong. People can't afford it. But you've kind of led me here. We're actually already undertaking this energy transition. It's already occurring right now. And I'll give examples. Coal generation was fairly typical, certainly in the United States and certain pockets of Canada. That is changing radically to natural gas. It's still a fossil fuel, but it reduces the emissions by 50%. We're looking at EVs, the fact that EVs are progressively increasing market share all the time. And by the way, when these decisions are being made, they're being made because they're economical and it's a better product. It's a better product than, so I'm using the electric vehicle, for example. There's people that will buy it that because it actually, performance is better. It has more things that the consumer wants. And then if we just talk about climate change, we know that already there's a transition going on the distribution side because with all the storms that are going on, they've had to replace or change the infrastructure to allow or to ensure this infrastructure is available when there's storms, whether it's in Nova Scotia or in Texas so this is already happening, and it's happening unbeknownst to most people. And it's happening, yes, it's better for society, meaning, emission reduction, but it's actually better because it's more economical and more reliable, and it enhances the performance. And so I get disturbed when I hear people who don't want to change because it serves them better not to change for various reasons. But in actual fact, I'm going to say to you, it's changing and it's going to continue to change. And the people that are going to drag their feet, in my view, are the ones that are going to be left behind. Now that remains to be seen, but we are already, John, as you and I know, we're talking to some industries that now there's requirements that they have to reduce their embodied carbon in their product. There's now codes that are required to reduce that carbon content. And if these manufacturers that build these products don't change their carbon content, those products will not be specified in new construction. They won't be in business. And unfortunately, I don't think that discussion is understood by most. So I think we got to get on with it. I know some people don't want it, but I think there's a great opportunity, and it's driven by economics, truthfully. That's my take.
Can I add a bit to that? Because we are seeing quite a lot of, shall we say, arguments against particularly net zero and things like that. And they are all talking about we can't afford to do this at the moment. Two problems, I think, with this. One, we know if we do it in the future, it's probably going to cost more, is one thing. And the other thing, that many of those people who are arguing about we can't afford it aren't considering or quantifying the costs of if we don't do it. And because it's much easier to look at, it's going to cost, we're going to have to increase the cost of electricity by 20% in order to fund a sustainable grid. But you can get a figure on that. But to say what is going to be the cost to our health services or the cost to our insurance and everything else if we don't do something and we get the full impacts of climate change, those figures aren't being used in that balance. And I do think we used a little clip in a thing we did some time back about kicking the can down the road. And I think a number of the people who are saying we can't afford it, actually all they are doing is kicking the can down the road, and it's going to be more expensive.
Okay, so let's talk about that because I think we've had some guests who have discussed this. We've had some webinars that have discussed this. The early adopters in this particular case will be there'll be an advantage to them, and I'll give you a case example of electrification of vehicles, especially if we're talking about mid to large fleets. So the demand for power requirements for fleets that are large to mid-size, if you electrify, is pretty significant. And I think most people assume that, good, I'm going to buy this fleet and, I'm just going to hook it up to the utility and it's good. Well, it's not that easy or that quick, because sometimes the utilities do not have that power made available in that distribution system that you want to get. So you have to stop and check. And then I'm hearing from customers and it depends on the utility, but it could take them up to 2 years to upgrade that infrastructure to allow that power requirement. And these are people who are early at this. So the ones that are early will get that. Can you imagine the onslaught of and I'm thinking this might be 5% that are doing this early. Imagine as it turns into 13 or 20%, the amount of demand that will be put on that utilities just won't be able to get to. They just as quickly. And I think there'll be a disadvantage to the people that want to, because the economics will prove out that the electrification are beneficial. Worry that people that don't look at this, they'll lose out because it will take longer to get implemented.
Okay, then. So we've talked about this. We've said what transitions are. They've always been going on. There's another one going on. You've got to be on board. So what do people do next? And I mean, this is asking a question that we know the answer to, because that's one of the reasons why we're having this podcast. But you accept that you've got this transition. What do you do next? Right.
Can we just describe what the aspects of the energy transition are? Like we've talked about the decarbonization of energy requirements, whether it's for a fleet or for generation, things of that nature. So then we're looking at renewable energy to replace or supplement. And again, for a lot of our listeners, depending on where you are in the market, whether you're in Alberta or in other locations, renewable energy actually is cheaper to actually for cost wise when it's installed than the traditional. Now, to be clear, you do still need some traditional generation, because as the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun is, but the point is, renewable energy, it has a place, and it will be supplemented with battery storage. So renewable energy is another area. And then another area, John, which is really dear to our heart, is energy efficiency, which is talked a lot about. But truthfully, you and I both know it tends to be a transaction not really focused on all the time, right? So for buildings, transport industry, it's can I say it's a fringe discussion? I hate to say it.
It shouldn't be, though, should it? Because the kilowatt hour you don't use, you don't pay for, it doesn't emit GHGs, it doesn't need capacity in the system. It's one of the holy grails is to use less energy.
And it's probably one of the most cost-effective ways in this transition, right? It just makes good business sense. But most clients, it's not terrible. It's not a core of their business. Energy, as we've discussed, isn't really truly understood, so it's hard to make a business case. Right. And things that I've seen, that 37% of the carbon emissions will come from energy efficiency. It's the biggest thing that could be done. And the last item is electrification. And so that's looking at, increasing electrification to supplement or reduce the amount of fossil fuel. Now, I'll say this because I think we had a Jason Wolf from BC, Fortis BC, talked about that 86% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels. So we're not going to replace fossil fuels overnight.
No.
But electrification is going to have to happen to reduce that fossil fuel. And
it's worth Sorry, Dave.
Please.
It's worth touching on why electrification is important. And it is because electricity at point of use is zero emissions. And it's a really effective way of transmitting energy. And the theory being you do that and then you can have multiple clean sources of energy that you put into the grid and distribute it. But we have to be realistic. Whilst that's an ideal world, for a long time there are going to be some processes that still need fossil fuel or a flame or something else like that. You can't, it's not a step change. The transition is a ramp. It's not jump off a cliff edge.
I totally agree. And just for our listeners, there's predictions, certainly in Canada, that we would have to increase our generation, our electrical infrastructure by 2 to 3 times of what it currently is. That's a massive, massive undertaking that would have to be done.
That's the global
I'm not saying it
figure
can't
as
be
well.
done.
Yeah, I think that's the global figure as well. We're looking towards doubling the amount of electricity produced.
Right. So this is going to happen, and I think we've talked about this many times. For it to happen, and it needs to happen like quicker, like in the next 10 years, rapidly, because the technology's primarily there, but it will be a wartime effort. It will require a lot of people from industry, from society. It won't be reliant on the energy supply chain. It will need to be, the demand side will have to be actively involved to actually push this along, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. It's interesting there because I referred to the Manhattan Project, which was an example of a wartime project where every resource was put to it and something happened. And you can almost say, think about the COVID vaccine. Globally, we decided that was something that needed to be done. We put all sorts of effort to it, and a vaccine was produced in record times. So it does show that if the world wants to change and is suitably motivated, it can do it. But as you say, I don't think we have that level of motivation at the time.
Now, there are some trends that are actually driving this, again, that maybe most people don't realize. Certainly climate change, there's risks associated if you're not prepared for events that may damage your supply chain or your production. Or your building operating. That's something that has to be considered. Example being, okay, if we don't have power, what do we have for backup power? What options do we have? If the transmission line's down, can we have our own sort of generation or hybrid generation on site? So there's things that will have to be considered that never was considered before. We talked about some of the growing regulatory requirements, whether it's financial requirements that public corporations will now have to report by 2024, their footprint, carbon footprint. And as I stated earlier, there's now building codes that municipalities are driving for the amount of embodied carbon. So that's happening. And then in Canada, John, currently, I say currently because the way that our current government, federal government's in place, we have a carbon tax that people, and it's considerably, it's a price signal that will drive that. And last and not least, and this doesn't matter whether you're in Canada or in the United States, or I'm sure in the UK, shareholders are recognizing these risks and realize that if they don't do something, that the assets that they own could be stranded or could be devalued.
Yes.
And so they're now demanding companies that they have ownership to start taking action. So this is actually happening now, right?
Okay, so we really have made the case. Something's happening and you've got to do something about it. Okay, so, the average client of ours, the average corporation, how are we going to suggest that they start dealing with this?
Okay. I actually think there has to be a strategy in place.
Yeah.
I think there has to be people in place. And when I say people, that's not one person, that's not one department. This is a way of thinking that needs to be embedded in the corporation. And last and not least, and I stress, even though we've stated it last, it's almost first, but you have to have access to data. Now, we have talked about this in significant detail, almost in every podcast that we talk about,
Yeah.
but invariably, most clients don't have access to data, energy/carbon data. And if they do, it's not shared or understood what to do with it and how to use it. That's kind of the three areas. John, I'm sure you've got some stuff to add on what I've conveyed here, or modifications.
I think you're right with those three areas. I think there's a sort of what I call a state zero, which is understanding what your business is and how it uses energy. That's not with the numbers, because you don't have to have the numbers to start with, but knowing, if you're a cement manufacturer, you probably know how important energy is to you. But if you're a car manufacturer, it might be it's going to be different. And if you're making different types of products and various things like that, how important is energy to you? We were talking before we had this podcast, weren't we, about an organisation, and we determined that something like 80% of their energy was in transportation. So having that rough feel for it starts you off going, okay, our strategy has got to be one that really addresses transport. That organisation, if it had gone ahead and gone, oh, there's a lot said about energy efficient buildings, let's concentrate on that, they could have the most efficient buildings in the world and they'd have only touched 20% of their emissions. So understand that basic understanding, and it starts from there, because we often say if you don't measure, you can't manage, but you need to know what to measure.
Agree. Now, we talked about this at the very beginning, and that is you need to ensure that people understand the value and the benefits of this energy transition. But if the senior executives don't understand that or don't appreciate that this is impactful or will impact their business, there's a good chance this company or organization will not move the dial or be interested in moving the dial. And I know we have talked about this so many times that in the strategy, you need to ensure that the senior from board level to executives truly comprehend the benefit behind it. The challenge I think we've talked about before is that most senior management or board level, they might have a 5-year window, and they're looking for a return on their quite frankly, for the paycheck. They want to focus on short term because that's how they get paid. So that is somewhat problematic with our model, with our economic system. But there are some executives and understand that it actually is a requirement, even in the short term, that they need to get on that. But ultimately, we need to make sure they get on board.
And I'm going to overlay that with a couple of steps that we talk about. Two of the things that are important there is that the corporation and the people involved are firstly engaged and then make a commitment, because you need that commitment, you need that mandate, because otherwise somebody says, why are you doing that? Oh, I think it would be a good idea. Whereas if the CFO, the CEO, the CTO or whatever has mandated that we're going to do that, you then have a mandate to do your job. You can argue, yeah, we need to do that. And those people should only make that something that the company's going to do if it fits into the overall strategy, because that is another big mistake you and I've seen over the years. People try to address carbon, energy, whatever, its own, without looking at the strategic involved aspects of the company as a whole. And if it doesn't fit that, it's not going to float.
Yeah, John, really good point. And let's talk about this, because the commitment that is made has to be renewed annually, not just 5 years ago we made this commitment, because, and I can say this, and you probably could say this too, as a leader in your business, you'll get onto something and then you'll move to something else. You need to continue to reinforce that belief to all your stakeholders, from your employees to your customers. You've got to revisit and restate it so they actually know this is real. And by the way, things will change. Like things change. So you might modify, but still make a commitment, but modify how you're doing things. I think that has to be updated annually to make sure that people understand it, right?
And that can fit quite nicely into companies that are doing ESG reporting, because there you're going to do an annual report about what you're doing. And this is the thing, we've talked about this before, in ESG, E's the environment, and one of the big hitters in the environment is carbon, and one of the big drivers of carbon is energy. So actually, we could be really cheeky and say ESG should be energy, society, and governance.
Yeah. But let's start that campaign.
Yeah.
I'm doing a presentation tomorrow. I'll try that out and see how that works.
I'll interject and say that is out of both of your wheelhouses. We're not changing the in ESG.
Oh, let us.
Man.
This is what happens when you two get to, say whatever. We go down a rabbit hole and all of a sudden we're changing acronyms.
I'm going to try it tomorrow, John. I'll let you know how it works out.
I still think as a presentational tool, it's got some mileage.
No, it's funny. It's funny for sure.
Okay. So we ought to get serious again. So we've got some overall things. We've got a couple of steps in there. Can you put some more into what somebody should be doing, Dave?
Yeah, I think maybe you alluded to this, but I think that the actual third step in this whole strategy is you need to make sure you've got the appropriate people that are involved in this. So often, John, we see where it will be pushed to the sustainability department or health and safety. And they're isolated. They don't have the lens to talk or work with other departments.
Yeah,
it tends to be their responsibility, or they don't have the budget that helps them do the work. They're isolated and they're not feeding back continually to the board. So where I've seen this work really well is where they actually develop a multidiscipline team.
Yes.
And don't get me wrong, sustainability could be leading or facilitating that whole thing, but it needs a multidiscipline group that actually embeds this thinking in their business, because the decisions that are going to be made in this transition will impact different people. And you need to make sure that they buy in and give their input to make the best decision for a company. So again, I think maybe we talk about this in podcasts a lot, but it really needs to be reinforced within organizations.
I think you're right, going back to what I was saying about these things don't work if they don't fit with the organizational strategy. One of the ways of making sure that happens is by having people from different functions within the organization. And it can be surprising. I've known in the past that departments that you would have thought may not have provided much traction for a project or a program actually have, because they see a different angle to it. They see how it can be benefit to the business, and they can approach it perhaps with a different kind of enthusiasm.
Agree. So I was at an event recently again, and it was an ESG person that was speaking at a real estate level, and he conveyed at the time that he had experience in the real estate industry. He had taken on the sustainability route, but he didn't know and didn't understand energy, and he told the crowd that effectively he had to become an energy expert to actually become a sustainability champion. Because as we've talked about, that when we're talking about emission reduction and the transition, it's really energy that they have to focus on. So where I want to go here is that people that are involved in this have to be competent and have understanding and exposure. And most people that might be in sustainability, they might be trained on sustainability, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily trained or exposed in energy. And so getting trained and getting that exposure to how energy impacts the sustainability mode, scope 1 and 2, possibly 3, it's a big area. So certainly training for that group or people are essential. And again, I'm not convinced, because energy's not historically been a hot topic or well understood or seemed too complex, that most people have got involved in that. So they need to have that training as well.
Okay, so we've fleshed out strategy, we've fleshed out people. That leaves the third bucket, which is data.
Yep. Yeah. So let's get into that. So data, and a favorite question that I'm sure, well, John, you and I have been in the same room, is we'll ask executives, can you tell us how much money you spend on energy? And invariably they will shuffle papers and say, I think it's this, maybe it's not a big part of their operating cost historically. But as we just said, this world is changing. This energy transition will be front and center in how organizations move forward. So they're going to have access to information and data. They're going to have to know what they spend. They'll need to know how much energy they use. Where do they use it? And related to all those things are, what is the carbon content, whether it's for natural gas or electricity? Like natural gas is fairly straightforward, but electricity, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, could impact the carbon emissions because of scope 2. And so they're going to have access or need access to energy and related to carbon. Again, I want to convey to you, and John, and I know in Europe you tend to be further ahead, to be clear on this, but that's a missing element that I find here in North America. What are your comments? Because my perception in Europe is you're further ahead on this.
You think we are, but it's still, it shouldn't surprise me, but it does when we deal with somebody and we want information on energy usage. Sometimes the best you get is they go back to the accounts department to collect a bundle of invoices. And we need to be doing better than that.
Yes. Yeah. And you need that data to be extracted.
Oh, definitely.
It needs to be understood, which again can be daunting or challenging. And then effectively anything you do, you need to set a baseline, and you need that information to set that baseline. Again, that's pretty simple to people like ourselves here on this podcast because we've done it for years, but it's a brand new concept to most organizations. And if they don't do that or don't know how to do it or don't have the data, it's pretty hard to understand where their starting point is and where they want to go, right?
Yeah. And then you build on that. Is what we refer to as metrics. And it always surprises me because you talk to most business people, and if you say KPI, they're all over it. Yeah, we've got KPIs for this, KPIs for that. You need to have a set of KPIs for energy, carbon, and related activity. And they need to be ones that are relevant and understandable. So there's quite a bit of work in doing that. But of course, you can't do that unless you've got the data. You need to have a baseline, because how do you say, well, I've got a KPI, what am I comparing it against? Because that can produce a whole range of issues. And interestingly enough, we're seeing in some jurisdictions, we've got it here, under streamlined energy and carbon reporting, in your annual accounts, if you're a large enterprise in the UK, you have to have some kind of intensity metric for both CO2 and for energy. So, kilowatt hours per 1,000 pounds of revenue or tons produced. You're being asked for that now. Why not find units that make sense for your business and help drive performance improvement in the business like any other KPI should?
Absolutely. Now, one of the last things that I want to address here is I've stated continual that actually there should be a business case to do this. You shouldn't be blindsided to do it just for the sake of doing it. But to do that, everything that we've said you have to have, but the missing component is historically accounting people didn't have the data or the knowledge. And so you need to engage them and make sure they understand the information, and they can act as that third party within the organization to evaluate if it makes sense or not. It's what they do in every other practice for the business. I don't know how, well, I do know. They haven't been that active in the energy file because coming back to it, John, they didn't have the data, they didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the understanding. But with everything that we've said, if they do have that and they're engaged, they're competent, they are critical to making this thing stick.
Yeah.
And I say that because I will joke to many people that, the C-suite's really important, but the second group that's really important is the financial. They're right next to the C-suite because the C-suite wants to know everything of the status of their financial. And so you've got to get accounting involved on that.
Yeah. I agree with you there. And I'm just thinking about, we have a model that we use to approach these things, which is something we need to talk about in this podcast. But one element of it that we haven't talked about is undertaking an assessment of both the risks and the opportunities that the energy transition or low carbon or climate change bring to your organization. And again, too many people see it as a risk assessment and don't see that there can be opportunities. Moving your business to focus it on supporting the wind turbine industry is an opportunity that comes out of the energy transition. I mean, that's just a simple example. The joking one is with global warming, making air conditioning units and ice cream are positive things, because if the climate changes, people will want more ice cream. Well, that could, if you're an ice cream maker, is that a bonus? But it's trying to think about it and put it into a business concept. The other element that is a risk in that's going to hit us probably more impactfully than some of the others are the extreme weather circumstances that occur, and being adaptable and resilient to those. And again, that's part of, if you're having a plan to deal with all of this, you should be doing.
So I recognize time is of the essence, not only in actually executing this transition, but probably closing off this podcast.
I think we may have already overrun.
Yeah, but perhaps. I think, John, as you said, we've covered a lot of what we think are fundamental issues. And they're fundamental to us, and we've seen when they're done and executed really well, there's a business case. It makes it one of the most attractive things for customers to do. But we actually found that it actually needs a back office. It needs an infrastructure to ensure customers fulfill and take these actions. And so I want to make people aware that we have designed a platform to actually help people figure out their pathway, but an infrastructure to actually help support them and continue that efforts that we discussed so they do see a business case. And certainly if people have interest in that, it's our 360 Carbon Excellence Program. I think it would lead and just ensure people follow all the steps that we've discussed today.
Yeah, and not only that, we don't often press product or services during our podcast, but since we're in that position, we're also offering a number of training modules that will help people get to grips with this subject. And in fact, that's a really good low investment way of getting into the transition, is getting yourself trained up, understanding what you can and can't do, how to talk to people about the subject, and therefore being in a place to move it forward.
Agree. So that training we're making available monthly. So if people have interest in learning more, it is free. It will be a 1-hour training. There's no commitment on your part, but I think if there's interest, certainly the things that we've discussed here today we'd go into more detail and provide you with more guidance on how to actually execute this.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, John, what's the biggest takeaway for our listeners today?
Oh, what have I got to now try and condense everything we've been to? It's so much easier when we have a guest to do it a takeaway. I think my takeaway is going to go back to the thing. There have always been energy transitions, and in fact, they're always ongoing, and some of them overlap each other. It's wake up and smell the transition is my biggest takeaway.
Thanks for that,
Geez,
John.
I like that, John. I think my takeaway, Lysandra, is we're replacing the E for ESG for energy. No, all kidding aside. As John said, this is happening. And so you can deny all you want, but it's happening and it's going to pick up speed. And the ones that don't get on this, this is not a threat, it's just reality, you'll be left behind. That's the summary.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Survival is optional.
Yes.
Well, Dave, John, thank you for another great episode.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Lysandra. Thanks, John.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.